going to look at the story, the real story behind the story of Purim, as we take a deeper look at the scroll of Esther, the Megillat Esther. So we're going to do a little bit of some of our kind of like our Saturday morning Torah study. Look at the text. I've got a text for us from Sefaria, again, a great Jewish web source of classical and modern Jewish texts. Let me share my screen here for us, and we're going to get into right into the book of Esther. So, first, a word of comment. We, as we have seen in our Saturday morning Torah studies, we have been tainted by not only the interpretations of our tradition that has been handed down to us, but by movies and by other influences. In particular, the movie Exodus, Ten Commandments, Prince of Egypt. These movies have so influenced our perception of the text from Exodus that when we actually do our Shabbat Torah study from those very portions, we have to do a lot of undoing of the damages that those movies have left behind in us. Likewise, we're going to do the same thing with the book of Esther. The book of Esther, the scroll of Esther, and it actually comes as a scroll, is very, very complex and presents a very complex story that we have glossed over those more difficult parts of the story. Indeed, if we were to read this book to our children in English, we would probably never ever read it again. And we would certainly gloss over the more problematic parts. But here we are, a group of adults. We can handle the complexities. We can handle the complicated parts. We're going to get into the story of Esther and the story of Purim as we have done in no other time. Again, when we read the Megillah, either it is read in Hebrew very, very fast, and most aren't paying careful attention to the words, or we're reading and we are selectively and sometimes very creatively interpreting the story. Let's take a look. We begin, of course, with all of this. Vayihi b'yamei Achashveros, hu Achashveros hamolech, begins in the days of Achashveros. Achashveros, the Hebrew, who reigned over 120 provinces from India all the way down to Ethiopia. Already we are confronted with a historical inaccuracy. Was there ever any kingdom that spanned from India all the way to Ethiopia? No. Was there ever a king Ahasuerus? No, not in the recorded histories. However, it might be referring to King Xerxes, who would have been pronounced Herches, which is kind of close if you play telephone to Ahasuerus, Achashveros. All of it taking place in the land of Shushan. This is a real Persian story. In the third year of his reign, he gives a banquet where he invites all the officials and the courtiers to come. And for 180 days, he has displayed his riches. So this is a fraternity party that has gone on for 180 days. And at the end of this period, there's a special banquet for 7 more days, which is going to be held in the king's palace in the fortress of Shushan. And it describes the opulence of King Ahasuerus here, as a number of ornate decorations are set up on the palace. You know, there are silver rods and alabaster columns and couches of gold. There's royal wine served in abundance and served out of golden beakers, nonetheless. And the rule for drinking was, like I said, it's a fraternity party. No restrictions. Everybody is to drink themselves as much. The wine cellars are all of the king are all open. While at the same time, Queen Vashti is giving a banquet for the women. Isn't that very nice? Well, at the end of this 7-day banquet, the king, very merry with wine, orders his eunuchs in attendance to go bring Vashti before the king wearing a royal diadem to display her beauty for the officials, for she was a beautiful woman. Now, we don't go into depth with regards to this verse, but we are going to go into depths with regards to this verse. In particular, this is verse 11. Queen Vashti is ordered to wear a royal diadem to display her beauty. Now, you have to understand how our rabbis read text. We understand that the text is part of a dialogue. And whenever something is missing, the rabbis want to fill in those gaps. They do that with midrash, a creative interpretation, sometimes based on oral stories that were passed down, sometimes created by the rabbis themselves as they try to flush out the picture in the scene. This is going to become very important in a little bit, but for right now, we're dealing with Queen Vashti, who's been ordered to wear a royal diadem and to show off her beauty. What does that mean? Our rabbis understand that to mean to wear only her royal diadem. Okay? Only the tiara, only the crown. Why that? Because the text does not say her royal robes, her royal attire. The only reference to clothing is wearing the royal diadem, wearing her crown. There is no mention of anything else. And so we have to understand that at the outset, from the text alone, the simple reading of the text, Queen Vashti has been ordered to do a lap dance for all of the gathered princes in order to display her beauty. Okay? We have to take the whole verse in context. When we read this to our children, obviously we kind of gloss over the subtleties. We don't go into great depth as we do now, but we're all adults and we need to understand. This is a horrible, horrible story in so many different ways. And it begins right off the bat. So, what happens? Queen Vashti refuses. And yay for Queen Vashti, absolutely she should refuse. This is degrading, this is objectifying to women. Queen Vashti has the sense to say, oh no, no way. Well, the king Ahasuerus is presented here as really a bumbling idiot throughout the entire story. The king was greatly incensed. He's very angry. He doesn't know what to do. He consults with his learned sages as to what should be the appropriate thing to do. And his closest advisors gather with him, and they suggest the following: that Queen Vashti has committed an offense not only against your majesty, but also against all the officials of all the lands. For the queen's behavior will make all the wives despise their husbands, as they reflect that King Ahasuerus himself ordered Queen Vashti to be brought before him, but she would not come. There will be no end of scorn and provocation. If it pleases your majesty, let a royal edict be issued, and let it be written into the laws of Persia and Media, so that it will not be abrogated at all, that Vashti will be banished, okay? And furthermore, that all the wives will treat their husband with respect, high and low alike. And indeed, the law was passed. And such happens to Queen Vashti. She's now banished. This is misogynistic and male chauvinistic to the best. When we tell the story to our children, we just say that Queen Vashti was banished. But the reason that she was banished was because the other women of King Ahasuerus' land will now get it in their head that they can say no to their husbands. And so an example has to be made of Queen Vashti. She has to be banished so that women will know their place with regards to their husbands. This is absolutely terrible. We haven't even gotten through the first chapter yet, and we are presented with a horrible, horrible story. Absolutely a horrible story. So we have to remember that the reason Vashti's banished is because the women of the land might become uppity. And so we have to keep the women in their place, Your Highness. This is why Vashti is banished. Oh my goodness. So far, we would want to skip much of chapter 1 in the telling of the story to our children. But that's fine. That brings us to chapter 2. Because what happens? Well, King Ahasuerus just banished his number 1 wife, the most beautiful woman in all the land. Well, duh. And so sometime afterward, King Ahasuerus begins to reflect on Vashti and says, oh my God, I'm lonely. I just kicked the most beautiful woman in the land out. Now what am I going to do? And so the story gets worse. The king's advisors and servants say, let all the beautiful young virgins of the land be brought for your majesty. Let them all come here to Shushan. Let them be placed under guard in your harem. And let the virgin who pleases your majesty the most, let her be named queen instead of Vashti. And so sure enough, this is what happens. Now we enter the hero and heroine of our story. Mordechai, the son of Yair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish of the tribe of Benjamin, is living in the land of Shushan. He had been exiled from Jerusalem with the Babylonian exiles, which take place in 586 BCE, by King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. Here we have some historical facts. Nebuchadnezzar was indeed the king of Babylon, who invaded and conquered the northern kingdom of Israel, and finally the southern kingdom of Judea. And Nebuchadnezzar exiles many of the Judeans, especially the upper class. The upper class and the leadership have all been exiled, brought back to Babylonia. The Babylonians are then conquered by the Persians, which seems to be the origins of this story. This seems to be a real Persian story that the Babylonian Jews brought back with them when being conquered by the Persians. King Cyrus of Persia allows the Judeans to go back and rebuild a temple in Jerusalem. And so they do. There find a whole group of Jews who were not exiled and go and rebuild the temple. So anyway, we have here, of course, Mordechai. We learn that his niece or adopted daughter or cousin or something, whose Hebrew name is Hadassah, anyway, she's known as Esther, is very beautiful and a virgin. And so he talks Esther into joining this beauty pageant to become the next queen, hopefully. And so this is what happens to the women. Oh, and Mordechai tells Esther, don't tell him you're Jewish. Oh my goodness. Really, why the rabbis included this book in our Bible is just amazing. So here's what would happen to the people. Mordechai would hang around just to make sure things were going well. All right. Now, what happens? Well, there's going to be 12 months in preparation for this beauty pageant. 6 months, the women are going to be bathed with oil, and 6 months with perfumes, and they're going to be, beautified for 6 months. And for 12 months before that, they're having their hair done and their nails done, and they're all set. And here it is. After that, they would go to the king's palace and take whatever they need with them to the king's palace, and then they would be returned to the harem. And it would happen thusly. Each night, one of the virgins would go in the evening to the palace. They would leave in the morning. and they would go to the palace at night, and in the morning they would be returned to the other harem. So from this, again, we don't go into great details of this one with our children either, because each night a virgin takes her nightly belongings and goes to the king's palace, and in the morning she is returned to a different harem. What happens? King Ahasuerus gets to sleep with all these women. To quote Mel Brooks in the movie, "It's good to be the king." He sleeps with all of these women. Well, he sleeps with them? I don't know. They go up at nighttime, and in the morning they go into the other harem, and having had the night there. The rabbis understand this, that this is exactly what is going on. But wait a minute, something happens with Esther. When it came time for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, who was the uncle of Mordecai, who had adopted her as her own daughter, to go to the king, she didn't take anything except for what the guards advised her to. And Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus in his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tevet, in the 7th year of King Ahasuerus' reign. And the king loved Esther more than all the other women, and she won his grace and favored him more than all the other virgins. So the royal diadem, the crown, goes on Esther's head, and Esther is now queen instead of Vashti. Again, there's a lot missing here. Why does the king love Esther more than all the other women? What's going on, our rabbis ask. The text doesn't tell us. And so for our rabbis, what takes place is when Esther goes up that night, she does not sleep with the king, unlike all the other women who go there and, ready to jump into bed with the king because that's what they think they're supposed to do. Esther, however, in a real Persian twist, begins to tell the king a story that night, just like Scheherazade. And if you recall the story of Scheherazade, she's married the Sultan who, kills all of his other wives after a few nights. And for some reason, Scheherazade is convinced that she can save this man. Her family is greatly distressed. Scheherazade goes and she begins to tell a story on their wedding night that lasts for 1,000 nights. And at the end of that 1,000 nights, the king has fallen in love with Scheherazade and no longer desires to kill her. He's worked through his issues with women, whatever it is, and they live happily ever after. Esther, so that's the Persian culture and the story into which we find Esther now and the rabbis of our Talmud trying to flesh out this text. This is exactly what Esther does. She engages the king in telling a story that wins him over. She's not just going to jump into bed with him right away. She begins this tale. How long it lasts, we don't know. The rabbis have lots of different midrashim, creative stories about this. But the end is, of course, that King Ahasuerus has fallen in love with Esther, and she is now the queen. And there's a great banquet in honor of Esther's. And Esther, following Mordecai's instructions, does not reveal that she's Jewish. And that's the end of that part of chapter 2. The rest of chapter 2 has Mordecai, who learns of a plot to assassinate King Ahasuerus. The plot is uncovered. Mordecai reports it to Esther. Esther reports it to the king, and the matter is investigated, and indeed these two guards are hung. And that's the end of chapter 2. Chapter 3, we bring in our villain sometime later. How long? We don't know. But sometime later, King Ahasuerus promotes Haman. Ready? Boo! Boo! It's Haman, yeah. We boo and we hiss. This is definitely the holiday you want to invite your non-Jewish friends to come to a Jewish worship service because there we are dressed in costumes. We have noisemakers. we're sitting in our sanctuary. In the classical days, we were drinking schnapps, and we were quite boisterous, and we're reading from something that looks like a Torah. And every time we mention Haman, we boo and we hiss. And here we go. So Haman is now appointed is promoted within the king's retinue, and an order is issued that everybody is to bow to Haman, but Mordecai does not bow. And everybody's curious, why don't you bow? And indeed, Haman even sees this. This is terrible. Why don't you bow? And Haman is told, because he is a Jew, Yehudi. This is one of the few times in our scripture where the word Yehudi is used. Abraham is referred to as Ha'ivri, the Hebrew. Moses and Moses' encounter with Pharaoh, and Pharaoh's orders are in regards to the Hebrews living in his land. Here, Mordecai is identified as a Yehudi because he is of the tribe of and the territory of Yehuda, a territory that under Babylonian and Persian rule became known as Yehud. This is where we Jews get our name, and this is where Judaism gets its name. It's not from our origins with Abraham Ha'ivri, the Hebrew, and it's not with the emergence of the children of Israel or of the Hebrews of that time, but rather we are called Jews because we came from Judea. And that was the last independent Hebrew organized independent state, which was Judea, and which is in the south of Israel today. It includes Jerusalem and a little bit north, and down into a little bit of the Negev is that tribal area of Judea. And so anyway, Haman is now furious. And wants to, do something to these people. But he didn't want to just get rid of Mordecai. And instead, Haman plots to get rid of all the Jews. And so in the first of the month, this is the month of Nisan, there is going to be a lottery by which Haman is going to set the date of the execution of the Jews. And that's why the holiday is called Purim, because the Hebrew word, more of the Persian word used to describe this lottery is pur. And so he has this. And here we have the classic in verse 8, the classics of all anti-Semitic claims. Haman goes to King Ahasuerus and says, "There is a certain people scattered in your land whose laws are different from your own, and they do not obey your laws. If it please your majesty, I will pay you 10,000 talents of silver in order to take care of this situation." Again, Ahasuerus is a bumbling idiot, sure, gives Haman his signet rings and off they go. And the money and the people are yours, do see fit. And so Haman here exaggerates the truth, that they are not following the laws of the king. Well, it's only one law that they're not following, not bowing down to Haman. And so far it's only one Jew. It's Mordecai. But this is the classic tact of anti-Semites, is to take one aspect that is true within the Jewish community and exaggerate it to every Jew. So all Jews are rich, which is why so many of us are working so hard, because we're all rich. All Jews this, all Jews that. That is the tact of anti-Semites. So there is truth in this book. It's just not maybe necessarily the truth that is presented to us. Anyway, we know the story. Haman now has set the date. There's going to be an opportunity to kill all the Jews in the land, and the law has gone out, and there you have it. Mordecai discovers this and sends messages to Queen Esther and says, "Look, Don't think that just because you're living in the palace, that you're going to escape this. You and we are going to share the same fate. You've got to do something about this. Esther, says, look, I can't just walk in and see the king. You have to go invited. And if you're not invited, the guards there are going to kill you. And Mordecai says, you don't have a choice. We're either all going to die and you're going to die with us, or we need to have some sort of intervention. Esther does, as we know the story. She puts on her finest. There's a fast. She's going to fast because she's not sure if she's going to die that night or that day when she goes in to see the king. She steps in. The guard raises his sword to kill her. Ahasuerus waves Esther in. Esther invites them to a banquet. We know the story from Purim. This part is what we tell, and this is in keeping with the book of Esther. Esther holds this banquet, and it's at this banquet that she reveals that Haman is the one who is going to kill her and her people, that she's a Jew, and this is a terrible thing. Wow. This is where we usually end the story. But we're going to continue in the book of Esther because the story's not over with yet. Oh my goodness, no, it is not over with. So we have Esther's banquet, of course, and she's now revealed that Haman is the one who's going to do all of this. I skipped over the part about Mordecai being led around on the horse, but yeah. But it's what happens afterwards. So Haman is impaled immediately on the gallows that were meant for Mordecai. And King Ahasuerus gives the property of Haman to Queen Esther. Mordecai presents himself, and Mordecai is now in charge. And things, seem to be going well, except wait a minute. Esther reminds the king that, look, your order is still out there, that on the 15th day of this month, the people of your land, of all of these 120 provinces that you rule, get to kill my people. This is terrible. This is a disaster. We've got to do something about that order. And so King Ahasuerus, look, Mordecai, you figure out what you want to do. And so what they decide to do, Mordecai says, here's what we're going to do. We're going to issue to everyone in your 127 provinces, from India to Ethiopia, a rule signed by yourself that the Jews are going to assemble and fight for their lives. That Jews now have permission to fight back the day before. So it's not even in defense of, the people are going to kill you the next day. You now have permission to kill them the day before. And so sure enough, the order is distributed throughout all of the lands, and the Jews enjoyed light and gladness and happiness and honor. Chapter 9. And so here it is. Now the king's order has been executed that the Jews get to fight. And throughout the provinces of King Ahasuerus, the Jews in their cities are able to attack all of them who sought to hurt them. And this is what took place. It's a bloodbath. The Jews struck at their enemies with sword, slaying and destroying, wreaking their will upon their enemies. In the fortress of Shushan, the Jews killed a total of 500 men. They also killed the 10 sons of Haman, who are listed here. In keeping with Jewish tradition, the goal is to read these 10 names in one breath. Parshandata, Dalfan, Asfarta, Portha, Adalia, Aridatha, Parmashta, Arisai, Daridai, Varisatha. The 10 sons of Haman. But that's not all who died. In the fortress of Shushan, there may have been 500 that were killed, but there were more that were killed. Haman's 10 sons, of course. Then there were an additional 300 men that were slain in Shushan. And there were 75,000 foes who were murdered throughout all of the king's land. And then there's drinking and merrymaking and celebration and sending gifts to one another. And Mordecai releases dispatches throughout the year that the 14th and 15th of Adar are to be celebrated in perpetuity in great joy, because we have conquered Haman and those who were intended on destroying us. And that's why the festival is called Purim, to be just prescribed at this season in every year. And dispatches were sent throughout all the lands. And that is the story of Purim. Now that we get done with the murdering, it all ends that people were very much drawn to Judaism during this time, and the king lived a very long and happy and prosperous life. The end. So it ends in a bloodbath. It begins with male chauvinistic, misogynistic attitudes. It ends in a bloodbath where we Jews win, and it ends that we all live happily ever after. And that's the real story of the holiday of Purim. A much different story than we present to our children, a much different story, I dare say, than perhaps many of you may have heard of the real story of Purim. So, thoughts, comments, questions?
My thoughts, Harry. I'm not sure what's real or fantasy at this point. You've presented two pictures, and they're logical. And you've presented how we as parents, I'm not a parent, but collectively as parents, treat these stories with our children in order to shield them from the violence. But the question is, are they both fiction? That's a question in my mind.
And it's a very good question. And depending upon who you ask, my thoughts are this. Yes, it is myth. This is a mythical story. It is more than likely a result of our encounter with Persian culture, which celebrated a springtime ritual. Okay? Springtime does something crazy to the human being. We've known this. We call it spring fever. We've experienced it, especially in the more colder climates. When spring comes in, you can feel it in the air. You can taste it. Something is different about this particular season. In the pagan world, spring was a battle. Spring resulted from a battle between the winter war gods and the spring summer gods. And if you don't have spring, you don't have food. We have to have spring. If we don't have spring, we don't have our summer crops, and we die. We do not have food to eat. And so the season, the changing of the season was actually a battle amongst the various gods who each controlled their own particular season. There is, within Persian culture, the following. There is, at this time of year, at the springtime, there is a battle between the war winter god, Marduk, and the spring fertility goddess, Ashtart. Marduk, Mordecai. Ashtart, Esther. More than likely, what our ancestors did was what Christianity did to some extent. We Jews wanted to celebrate the springtime Persian ritual. It was a time of getting drunk. It's a Mardi Gras. It's a spring Mardi Gras. The cold winter is over. The sun is staying up longer. The days are getting longer. The air is, much more comfortable. We're not freezing at night. things that we in our modern homes with furnaces, we live in the lap of luxury. You didn't always have fires in your home to keep you warm back then. And so as the air was warming up and the ground was warming up and things were transitioning to spring, oh, this is a great time. And we were probably celebrating this Persian pagan spring ritual about Marduk and Ashtart. And what happens is that our rabbis, we got to give them something Jewish to celebrate here. Judaized the story, threw in some more uniquely Jewish stuff. We've got Haman the anti-Semite. We got the Jews winning. Okay, we didn't win our wars. The last, wars we won as Jews was with Solomon. Since that time, various empires came to be in the land of Israel. The Greek Empire, the Babylonian Empire, then the Greek Empire, then the Roman Empire. So, we hadn't won a victory in a very long time, as we are now exiled in Babylonia. And so a story comes about where we win. Not only do we win, but people are so impressed with us that they want to become part of us. This is a fabulous story. And so the ceremony is Judaized so that people now have a Jewish reason to celebrate this springtime crazy Mardi Gras holiday. That's what many of our anthropologists and scholars lead us to believe.
Rabbi, okay, it's Rita.
Yes.
Just before this, I was listening and watching the CSP program on Purim, and I'll send you the link. It was really interesting. But the rabbi who spoke really convinced me that Xerxes and Ahasuerus were the same person, and you're looking at it linguistically and historically. And also he was able to take the history of Xerxes' life and the book of Esther, and the timeline was right. The ending was totally different, but the essentially the beginning of the story was right. And the link I'll show that I'll send you, the rabbi was actually doing a virtual tour of the British Museum, and so he was showing the different artifacts from that time, and the golden chalice to drink from, and and their whole drinking culture. So it was really interesting.
Yes, absolutely. Xerxes, and again, it's spelled Xerxes, and the X is pronounced more like Arachet. Xerxes, which became Ahasuerus. He's living in the 5th and 6th century BCE. And so, this is after the Babylonian exile of the Jews. This is after Babylonia has been conquered by the Persians. And that's when the story of Purim seems to, come to light in the book of Esther. It really doesn't catch on. I mean, it was a holiday in Jewish tradition, and the Talmud says, you're supposed to get so drunk that you can no longer distinguish between the phrase, blessed be Mordecai and cursed be Haman, which is really weird for our rabbis because they're usually very moderate in their instructions. Never too much of this, never too much of that, middle of the road stuff. Here, for the holiday of Purim, they're commanding, us to get absolutely blottoed, which, we understand today is perhaps not an appropriate commandment to follow, especially if you are dealing with addiction issues or are an alcoholic. This is definitely not the thing you should be doing. And so we understand there are some issues. And yes, the story of Xerxes, but we don't have in that story, the anti-Semitism and the Jews, doing all the killing that they did, that seems to be added by again, our sages. But the holiday of Purim really doesn't take off as a Jewish holiday until we get into, and here's a hint, okay, for those of you who know the story, how many corners does Haman's hat have? How many corners are on Haman's hat? Right, 3 corners. Hakova sheli, shalosh pinot, hakova sheli. My hat has 3 corners.
Nice.
That's not the hat that Haman would have worn. Haman would have worn a turban, because that's what everybody wore in the 5th and 6th century BCE in the land of Persia. Haman would have worn a turban. It takes off in the Middle Ages and in the medieval ages, where European aristocracy wore a 3-cornered hat. Think of Paul Revere. That was the style of the hats. And so our ancestors, our European Ashkenazic ancestors, were suffering under brutal Christian oppression in many places throughout Europe. And so the holiday of Purim really begins to take off as Christian anti-Semitism and the anti-Semitism that pervaded Europe at that time is having disastrous, horrific consequences upon the Jewish communities. Jewish communities were being kicked out of various places, were being murdered at whim. Haman here and the 3-cornered hat reference is our ancestors' opportunity to make fun of the Christian Europe of that time. Understand, this is not Christianity. This is the Christianity that our ancestors were experiencing in the 14, 15, 1600s, which was brutally anti-Jewish. Burning at the stake, forced conversions, expulsions, horrible atrocities committed. Inquisitions, yes, all of these things. And so here is where we developed an interesting Jewish psychological response. We made fun of our Christian tormentors in guise of Haman. And that 3-cornered hat is a dead giveaway that this is not about the Haman of the 5th and 6th century BCE, but rather this is about the Haman that we are encountering today. These people who want to kill us simply because we're Jews. So this is an interesting psychological and cathartic twist that Judaism brings out of Purim, or rather reads into Purim at this time. And in an absolutely healing way, we make fun of those who were tormenting us.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
you made a
Yes,
comment
Sheila.
that has me thinking a little tangentially, so I apologize for going a little bit off topic. You said this is a, shall we say, interesting book to include.
Yes.
My understanding, which doesn't mean much, is that the Old Testament was actually compiled by a Christian or a Christian group many years ago. They took the stories and put them together. Is that true? And if so, why wouldn't the rabbis have gone in and been more selective?
That's not so. The Tanakh, what's called the Old Testament, is put together by our rabbis. They are the ones who codify what's in and what's out. The book of Esther is in, the book of Maccabees are out.
Right.
By the time we get to the 4th, 3rd century or so, BCE, the 4th or 5th century BCE, we have the Torah now. The book of Deuteronomy allegedly is discovered by the Jews, Ezra and Nehemiah, who under Cyrus the Persian are allowed to go back and rebuild Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. In their rebuilding, in the book of Ezra and the book of Kings and the book of Nehemiah, is recorded that this scroll was discovered and King Josiah, reads it aloud now and institutes it. Well, it really seems to be King Josiah's reformation of Judaism at that time, as it is reconstituting itself in Judea. That seems to be the origins of the book of Deuteronomy. But it gets assigned to the fifth book of the Torah. So we know that there's 4 books. This one becomes the 5th book, and there you go. Now the Torah is closed. It is canonized. It is locked by the time we get to that period of time, 4th, 5th century BCE. Then, our sages and later the rabbis are wrestling with what else to include. Prophets. We included all of these prophets, but they also excluded a bunch, which you can find in the apocryphal literature, the other sacred literature that's not quite part of our Bible, which include the book of Maccabees for us Jews. The book of Esther, the scroll of Esther, is included in our Bible by the rabbis. And I think it's included because, hey, we won. So it's a little derogatory towards women. That's okay. The males kind of liked that aspect of it. Wouldn't it be nice if we could actually rule our women that way? So, a flight of fancy here of our rabbis. We can excuse them their naivete, given the time in which they were living. And so, yes, so it was our Bible, our Tanakh, Torah, prophets, and writings was canonized by our rabbis. And so they included it. They leave the book of Maccabees out, interestingly enough. I think more because the book of Maccabees is like reading Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. It's about this battle and that battle and what took place here and how many died there and what type of fighting took place. And we were busy fighting against Rome. And we were citing the Maccabees as the reason why we should fight against Rome and kick Rome out. And our rabbis, wisely enough, knew that we're not going to kick Rome out. They will decimate us, they will squash us, they will kill us all. And so the book of Maccabees is left out. And that's also, as we looked at when we talked about Hanukkah, why the oil plays such a major role in the rabbinic understanding of Hanukkah, whereas the book of Maccabees, it's all about a military victory.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Last thoughts or comments? Yes.
Yes.
Go ahead, Steve.
I was reading something historically that suggested that because I'm big. Excuse me. It suggested that because Mordecai was of the tribe of Benjamin and a descendant of King Saul, that politically it also was advantageous to the writers at that time, because they were able now to end with King Saul being, even though he was the one who didn't, had been ordered to kill the Amalekites, and he did refuse to do it during his lifetime. Now his descendants have actually sort of corrected his mistake, and they were saying that historically that was good for some of the people politically in power at the time, that their ancestor now is whitewashed, if that makes sense.
Yes, in a way. So Amalek is, identified in Scripture as the eternal enemy of the people of Israel, and we are to blot out the memory of Amalek. We are to kill Amalek. However, the book of Esther does not identify Haman as being a descendant of Amalek. It is the rabbis of the Talmud who provide that lineage, and that Haman was indeed an Amalekite. That Haman's father, who was cited in the book of Esther, was an Amalekite. But the Megillat Esther, the scroll of Esther, never identifies Haman as being of the Amalekites. So that's all going to be built on much later, a later reading and interpretation of the book of Esther. If the book of Esther is referring to a time that happens in the 4th and 5th century BCE. King Saul goes back to 1000 BCE, and it is the Israelites under Moses in the 1500s BCE who were supposed to have wiped out Amalekites, so 500 years before Saul. They didn't deal with Amalek, and the rabbis of the Talmud actually also do another psychological thing with Amalek, and that is Amalek is not some third party that we have to be on guard for, but rather Amalek lives in us. Amalek is part of us when we want to attack from the rear, when we want to attack the weak, when we want to, it's part of our ego defense mechanisms. And so the rabbis read a lot of psychological stuff into Amalek, that the Amalek we are commanded to obliterate is the Amalek inside each one of us. But an interesting midrash here to try to correct the fact that none of the past generations have dealt with Amalek. And so here Mordechai is able to do so if Haman is indeed a descendant of Amalek. Good point. Very good. Excellent. Any last comments or questions? Great. So what we're going to do next week is turn our attention to a little more serious topics. We will look at, as suggested by Rita, Martin Buber, a very complex and complicated figure in our tradition, both revered and maligned at the same time, and yet he is most well known for his book, I and Thou, which philosophical work, which we will have a chance to take a look at in greater detail. And when we understand Mordechai Buber's life, we can certainly understand why he was so motivated in that relational kind of Judaism that we shall see. And we'll take a look at that next week. With that, I am grateful to everyone who has attended. Thank you all so much for joining us for tea on Tuesdays at 2.